I realized pretty quickly that there were three sets of stories that we needed to look at. We needed to look at stories of the past, and we're going to talk about a few of them. And Misha mentioned a few of those historical moments. We're going to learn about stories of the present. We need to understand who's doing innovative work right now with immigrant origin students. And we need to learn of stories of the personal, of young people, of young immigrants themselves and their experience of our schools. And if we can draw on these lessons, the past, the present, and the personal, I think we're best set up to imagine what's possible in immigrant education. Misha, you set us up perfectly to think about the overwhelming and really devastating statistics around bullying and the lack of welcome and lack of belonging around for immigrant origin students that they are reporting, that teachers are reporting. So what do we do about it? And as you've just said, it doesn't just happen. And so how do we get schools to be places where students feel that sense of belonging, where schools are nurturing that sense of belonging for all students, but particularly for immigrant origin students? And I think what's been powerful in the last couple of years for me is to see how belonging has become a central part of our conversations. That even like 4 or 5 years ago, if you think back to it, belonging wasn't at the center of those conversations. And belonging is really fundamental for all people, for all young people, but really just all of us. And what happens if we feel that sense of belonging, if we feel that sense that we can arrive in a space, work in a space, be present in a space in our full selves, our full identities. And I think it's particularly important for young people who are new to the country as they're creating new homes and new lives here. So how do we do that? So I've been doing this work for a while now, and actually, so I teach at Lowell High School for the last about decade or so. I'm currently on sabbatical, but back in 2019, I set out for my classroom to understand how we could better support immigrant origin students, how we could reimagine immigrant education. And so I set out for my classroom for a year to learn in the classroom of others. And I realized pretty quickly that there were three sets of stories that we needed to look at. We needed to look at stories of the past, and we're going to talk about a few of them. And Misha mentioned a few of those historical moments. We're going to learn about stories of the present. We need to understand who's doing innovative work right now with immigrant origin students. And we need to learn of stories of the personal, of young people, of young immigrants themselves and their experience of our schools. And if we can draw on these lessons, the past, the present, and the personal, I think we're best set up to imagine what's possible in immigrant education. And so a number of years ago, I set out for my classroom to do this, to sit in the classrooms of others, to sit down with young immigrants and to sit down with folks who they and their family transformed history, whether they were Supreme Court cases, laws, or movements. And lo and behold, all of them are coming back to that feeling of belonging. And so what does belonging then mean? As going back to Misha's point, we don't just arrive at belonging. How do we actually do that? We're educators, or we're folks in the community working with schools. What are the policies and practices that help us get there, that help us nurture belonging for immigrant origin students? So I'm going to propose to you 8 pillars. And I hope they resonate with you. It's totally okay if they don't, or if there's perhaps other ones that you think should be added. But these, for me, these I've drawn from all the lessons I learned from folks across the country. And my thinking is, and as I've talked to and worked with educators across the country who these have resonated with, is that this gives us a little bit more of a roadmap. It's not prescriptive of exactly what you need to do because there's one right way, but there's a whole series of policies, practices, and programs that we are doing right now in our schools that are either helping or hindering belonging. And I think if we analyze them, they fall into these 8 categories, these 8 pillars. And so when we're thinking to Misha's question about, so how do we get to the place where our students have that sense of belonging? Because we're not going to just arrive there. What are the policies, practices, and programs in your classroom, in the halls of your school, in the school policies, in the district policy, the state level policies that are getting at each of these in turn? And if we can work on each of these together, I think we're going to be nurturing that sense of belonging for students. And what I love too about this is that there's a role for everyone in this work, from the classroom teacher who's working at the level of their classroom to the policymaker at the state capitol and everyone in between. And so what I wanted to do is to just tell you a few stories of how we get to that work of belonging. How do we tackle each of those? And I'm going to give you a few stories of the past and a few stories of the present. And then we're going to be getting into a panel and I can tell you more stories. I'm going to tell you now that I'm a history teacher. And so I get like nerd out about the history. And so I'm going to rein myself in. And Misha and Adam, I like give you full rights to just like shut me down here and be like, okay, move on. But the history is really powerful, and I think it's really important for us to know about. I'll just say a note, and Adam and I have talked a lot about this, that the history of immigrant education is not often taught, and it needs to be taught. And I will be totally honest that the stories that I share in my book are stories that I did not know before I started writing this, but they need to be known. And I now teach them in my class. So I'm going to give you just three briefly. Okay, so the first story takes us to rural Nebraska in 1920, where Robert Meyer, who was a parochial teacher in a one-room schoolhouse, is teaching the Bible in German during recess on a May afternoon. And for doing this, he is arrested. Because at the time in Nebraska, it was illegal to teach languages other than English. Indeed, in about half the states in the country, it was illegal to teach languages other than English, and in some cases to speak languages other than English in public spaces, including on the train and on the telephone. But Robert Meyer doesn't back down. And he takes his case all the way up to the Supreme Court. And in 1923, the Supreme Court comes back in favor of Robert Meyer, enshrining for the first time the right for teachers to teach and students to learn English languages other than English. Just a powerful example of the courageous impact of individuals. But I'll note here too on the impact of bullying, because this is a conversation we're having that's centering on the impact of bullying and belonging, is I had an opportunity to talk to someone at the heart of this case. That 11-year-old boy, Raymond Parpart, who was reading the Bible in German when his teacher was arrested. He has since passed away, but his daughter is still alive. She's in her 80s now, and she still lives in the same community that her father lived in and that Robert Meyer taught. And she told me the story of how when she was about the age of her dad, about 11 or so, when Robert Meyer was arrested, that Robert Meyer came out of retirement for a year. And he came and lived at their house for that year, and he taught at the school that he was once arrested in. And he taught her. But never once during that year did he teach her German. And her father never taught her German. And I think just a really important impact of even on the wins, we can like stop the story at Robert Meyer's win in 1923 of he gets the success for immigrant origin students, for all students to learn languages other than English. And yet there is the lasting impact of xenophobic policies and practices. And so thinking about those messages we send young people that they don't belong in their full identities, and how that can have a profound impact on their children and on their grandchildren. So I just wanted to note that here. Okay, next story. Again, I could go on because there's so many parts of this, but I want to take us to California. And I want to take us to Westminster, California, where the Mendez family have recently returned to Westminster. They've leased a prodigious asparagus farm in Westminster, California. And they go to enroll their kids in their dad's alma mater. And the school looks at the kids and goes, nope, we're not taking them. They have to go a mile away to the quote unquote Mexican school. Because at the time in California, much of the Southwest, there were segregated white and Mexican schools. The Mendezes don't back down. And so they organize and they talk with other families and they take the money from the prodigious asparagus farm and they hire a civil rights lawyer and they sue the school districts. And their case goes up to the Ninth Circuit. And by the time it goes up to the Ninth Circuit, it is supported by amicus briefs from across the country, including one written by the NAACP, written specifically by Thurgood Marshall, who's watching this case as a test case. And in 1947, the case comes back in favor of the Mendezes. 2 months later, the governor of California desegregates schools across the state. 6 years later, the governor of California steps down and assumes a new position. And for my history buffs in the room, what that position is, of course, you'll know, it's Earl Warren, Supreme Court Chief Justice. And one of the very first cases he hears on the court is Brown v. Board of Education, argued by Thurgood Marshall, who has in his notes the notes from the Mendez case, which have been shared by David Marcus, the civil rights lawyer for the Mendezes. Now, there are other stories woven in, and I can't go into them in detail right now, but one is that asparagus farm and why the Mendezes had leased that asparagus farm. They leased it from the Munemetsu family, who had recently been incarcerated during the Japanese incarceration camps of World War II. And over the course of World War II, they kept the farm driving money to Potsdam incarceration camp. And after the war, the Munemetsus and the Mendezes lived together on the farm for a while. And there are other powerful stories, and I'm not going to go into them because of timing, but there are more, so come find me. So the last story I'm going to leave you with brings us to Texas. And this is one that is front of mind for many of us right now as we're looking into the new year and protecting and thinking about ways to protect our students. That in 1977, Tyler's school district in Tyler, Texas, changes their policy and starts charging $1,000 tuition to any family, any student who cannot prove legal residence, which is about 1/4 of an annual undocumented Texan's income. 4 families risk immediate arrest and deportation to advocate for their students' education. And this story, for me, is in the visual, in the story that Alfredo Lopez, one of the kids in the case, told me about, of how his parents, the night before going to the courthouse, they pack up their white Dodge Monaco to the brim. And the next morning, they wake the kids up before sunrise and pack them in the car and drive 2 blocks to the federal district courthouse for this case. And they're packed the car to the brim because they know that by walking into that courthouse, they are prepared to be immediately arrested and deported. And that's a risk they choose to take for their kids' education. And this case, of course, goes on to become the 1982 Plyler v. Doe case, which we know that is a landmark case that affirms and enshrines the right for all students, no matter their documentation status, access to the K-12 system. And I put these 3 historical stories out there because they're important stories for us to know about as educators, as community members, to think about the ways in which courageous individuals and communities have fought back against bullying and xenophobic policies. There's a lot of lessons to learn from them. There's also stories that need to be taught, and there's stories as educators we need to know because they help us better protect our students. But let's go to the present for just a few moments, because how do we do this belonging work now and here in the present? So I'm going to give you a few examples very, very quickly. Guilford County, North Carolina. Myra Hayes, an amazing educator. And she and her team for close to a decade had been coming up with all sorts of different programs and approaches to support her immigrant origin students across the entire district, 650 miles, 7,000 students. And I went to visit a classroom, a 9th grade classroom of students new to the country less than a year, and they were working on the following sentence that you have in front of you. On an autumn night in 1607, a furtive group of men, women, and children set off in a relay of small boats from the English village of Scrooby in pursuit of the immigrant's oldest dream, a fresh start in another country. And they're pulling the sentence apart and putting it back together and trying to figure out what some of the harder words mean. It's a complicated sentence. And one of Myra's team leans over to me and says, if you had been here 3 years earlier in this classroom, you would have seen students examining the following sentence. Chimpanzees are eating bananas. Bananas are yellow. What wildly different expectations we have for our students in those 2 sentences. And so when we think about what does belonging look like, it can look like a lot of different things. And one of them is, what are the expectations we have for our students? Our students pick up on that. Adam, I think, has told a really powerful story in actually in a conversation we had recently this fall of a student, Adam, correct me if I'm wrong, from Brazil, who was going, in Brazil, I was doing like really high level maths, and here I'm bored out of my mind. They're treating me like little kids. And I can't tell you the number of students who have told me a similar story. And so when we think about belonging, we really need to be examining, do our policies in schools equate our students' English levels with their intelligence? Whether we're doing that intentionally or not, what's the message we're showing to our students about what their strengths are, what their academic strengths are? It's really, really important to be making sure we have high expectations for all the students, and that's a part of the belonging. And I just saw in the chat that we have Soledad here, who is from Gilbert County, who's an amazing, amazing educator. And so I just want to shout out Soledad, who is part of this team, who I got to learn from. Thank you, Soledad, for being on this. She's amazing. This team is amazing. We have so much to learn from them. Okay, moving on. Another example is a group of young people who are often excluded from schools. Indeed, Joe Napolitano wrote a report, a pretty damning article last year, finding that schools across the country are turning away older students who have had interrupted education. So imagine you are a 16-year-old and you've perhaps never had a chance at academic formal schooling. If you arrive in the US, you are likely going to be put in 10th or 11th grade. Good luck. Now, Joe's article from last spring is showing us that actually you might not be put in school at all and you're going to be turned away and told you should just go to adult ed. Now, neither of those are winning strategies for this young person or for our community. And so how do we best support young people who've had their educational opportunities really limited or perhaps totally stolen from them, their academic education opportunities? And how do we both honor the fact that they might need to start out at a kindergarten level of education, but they're not kindergartners. They're the young adults who've likely shouldered the responsibilities of young adults for many, many years. The Global Village Project in Decatur, Georgia, is a school that's just it's the only school dedicated in the United States to refugee girls who've spent a long time out of school. And they do a whole range of approaches and strategies and structures I'm not going to go into here, but I'm happy to talk about to help students recapture all those years of lost learning. And this is a group of young people who are being excluded from our schools all across the country right now and have huge gaps in their education and are facing really challenging hurdles to be able to get ready to be able to succeed in high school and college here in the US. And one thing I'll tell you is that, and it struck me a couple of days into being at the Global Village Project, is I'd never heard so much laughter in a school. Never before. In any school that I've been to, just so much joyous laughter. And that doesn't mean the learning isn't hard and there aren't hard days. But what the school has done in creating a community where these kids who have been excluded from school again and again and again feel that sense of belonging so deeply and that sense of community so deeply that there is so much laughter is a beautiful, beautiful thing. I'll give you another. So let's go to, where are we going to next? We're going up to North Dakota. Leah Jolke, an amazing educator, was really seeing the divide to what Misha's been talking about between students, particularly between newcomers and students whose families have been here for many generations. And so she specifically created a class for what we're going to call old Dakotans and new Dakotans. And this is at the classroom level of the ways in which she structured her curriculum and her instructions and her projects and her practices to create opportunities for students to learn from each other, for them to step into each other's shoes, for them to teach alongside each other, and building these bridges, really intentionally building these bridges at the classroom level between students in a state that was, at the time when I was talking with her, actively trying to allow cities the opportunity to bar refugees from resettlement. And her students went and testified at the State House against that. And so thinking about the xenophobic policies in the community that were impacting her students and thinking about ways that she could make an impact, both at the state level of her students testifying, but also at the individual student level, and building those bridges between students. And then I'll just give you one from my own classroom to close us out. So my students, every year we start our study of US history with a study of immigration from the early 1900s. I'm pulling these stories that I learned from history. And I wanted a project that would center my students' stories. Because I was looking at all these lessons and these project ideas online many years ago, and they said something akin to have your students imagine they had to leave their country. Now, of course, my students don't have to imagine, they're experts. And so how to center their expertise, which are so often not centered in schools, and how to really center the idea for my students that their story is an essential part of our study of US history. So what we do is we write a cookbook, and each student chooses a favorite family recipe, and they go home or they call up mom overseas or dad or grandma or grandpa overseas, and they document that recipe. And so we're centering our families as teachers in our classroom and our community. They document that recipe and they translate into language that others can understand. Cook until done. What does that mean? And then they write a story about that food. And maybe it's connected to something they eat on their way home from school, or maybe it's connected to a holiday. And they tell a little bit too of their story of their migration here, because this is a piece of history that they're sharing with all of us. And then they cook the food and we all get to try it. So that building of community and building of curiosity of eating together. And then finally, we publish a cookbook and we share it out in the community. And we've been doing this for a number of years, and beautiful collaborations arose from this. One, the cookbook is now taught in the 3rd grade curriculum in our district as a history textbook, as students are learning about our city. But 2, the other one, and I give full credit to the food service teams for this, who reached out to us, is the food service team reached out to us, had recently won an award, and they go, we'd like to collaborate with you. And so, Misha, if we could have the next slide. The cafeteria team each month chooses one recipe from the cookbook, and they adapt it, nutrition guidelines and what they can cook at scale. And then they bring it to our students, really positioning our students as the experts and teachers that they are, and they get feedback and they modify, and then they serve it at our high school and across the district to 14,000 students. And in this way, for the first time in our school district, food from Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Brazil, Cambodia, Colombia, Dominican Republic, Guatemala, Somaliland, Rwanda, the Democratic Republic of the Congo have been served for the first time. And I just note that our community is the 2nd largest Cambodian community outside of Cambodia. And it's been that way for a number of decades. And it wasn't until 4 years ago, when the district reached out to us and served 2 of my students' food, Samnang and Nempise, who are in that picture, that Cambodian food was served in our district, in our cafeterias. And on some level, it's a really small thing that the food that our students are eating at home is served in our cafeterias. And in some ways, it's a really big thing. And it really is another signifier to our students that their identities are important and they're valued in our schools. And so when we think about belonging, how do we think about all the practices and programs and policies, from the huge policies at the state level to the policies and practices and curriculum ideas in our classroom that are all feeding into that sense and nurturing that sense for our students? And I'm going to turn it at this point back to Misha.